We're so glad you could be here tonight. And again, we encourage everyone to turn their cameras on if you don't mind being seen at this time of the day, because we like this to be a nice discussion, interactive, and we just like to connect with you. If you really don't want to be on camera, don't worry about it, but we really do encourage it. So we're going to just wait another minute to see if folks pop in. Ready. Again, welcome to all who are coming on in. And great. Yep. Thank you. I was going to say, Christina, we'll see you soon. We're not going to fault you. Again, some folks are double dutying and being, some folks are even in their cars. So we just appreciate you being here. But if you can, pop on the camera at whatever time you can get on there. So we are glad you are here today. And my name is Susanne Killian. I'm the Associate Director with the Center for the Business of Health. And this is one of our Fireside chats, which is part of our program that's called Career Networks. And tonight we are joined by Devin Rosenthal, who's a Vice President with NovaQuest Capital Management. And this Fireside chat again too is, I kind of put a blanket over it. Although we talk about venture capital, et cetera, I feel that finance would be an overarching umbrella of this talk, as maybe a number of our other pillars. So we're glad you're here. Again, this is part of our Career Networks. We'll pop that, the Career Networks link in, which you've probably already been on if you've registered for this. But if you want to see some more of our resources and some more of the events coming up, I'll pop that in the chat later on in the talk. But we are so glad to have Devin here today. He's also a UNC MBA graduate, and I'm going to say it was 2019, so really not that long ago, but he'll tell you a little bit more about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it over to Devin to give a more thorough introduction about himself. But before that, remember, at any time, please feel free to raise your hands and ask questions or just unmute. I'll stop every couple of moderator questions for you all to go ahead and contribute your questions as well. But don't feel afraid to contribute as we're having the conversation. So Devin, take it away.
Thanks, Suzanne. Really excited to be here with you all today and to have a chance to really have a conversation. So look forward to you all, chiming in with your questions as we go through. I can start with a little bit of monologue here, and there's a lot of different ways we can take the conversation from there. But maybe to orient everybody with sort of who I am, where I come from, and what I'm doing right now, let me start with that last piece first. So as Suzanne mentioned, I'm a vice president with NovaQuest Capital Management. And what we do, we're a life sciences focused investment firm that strikes a sort of interesting niche. I think a lot of folks are familiar with venture capital. Maybe some folks are familiar with debt as well. We're sort of somewhere in between the two. So what we do is we make investments that are focused on pivotal stage or typically phase 3 clinical trials in a specific product and sometimes a specific indication. We provide financing for those trials and some early commercialization work. And then we take our returns off of a mix of milestones and royalties. So we're what's called a non-dilutive funding source. So again, not like equity in that way, not like debt, because we kind of take a different flavor to the non-dilutive model, which we can dive into in a little bit. What I do at NovaQuest, so I'm involved primarily in our due diligence efforts. So everything from our initial triage of potential investment opportunities to running that full due diligence process, which is a fairly comprehensive process where we look at product development programs, we look at commercial opportunity. We're using this to design the financial structures for the transactions that we're doing, and likewise model out the commercial potential of the programs that we're potentially investing in. And then the negotiations that go on alongside that, the contracting, and eventually if a transaction closes, doing the alliance management on the back end. So it's a pretty broad-based role, a lot of pieces that I can go into a little bit more detail about. Really what this position that I'm in these days and have been in for the last 3 years is a culmination of a lot of the work that went into the career path that I've chosen and sometimes sort of meandered into along the way. So originally began as a scientist, did a PhD in cell and molecular biology, breast cancer research specifically, went sort of the canonical path of let me go and start a postdoc and think I'm going to become a professor, but realized about 5 minutes into that postdoc that I didn't see academia as being the path that I wanted to continue down. I was in Boston for that postdoc, which was a great place to have that sort of epiphany because it's an amazing networking area for the life sciences. So went around, had a lot of coffees, a lot of lunches, a lot of beers and such, and got to know a bunch of different people and was able to eventually land a position working for a small biotech company and making the jump both from academia into industry and also from the bench and into the clinical development realm. So I worked on the clinical development team at the small biotech, ended up working there for about a year, went and spent a little bit of time at Novartis in their oncology companion diagnostics group, which was actually a return to the bench for me and really reaffirmed the fact that I didn't see myself being a bench scientist like the industry, but wanted to sort of move further down that product development progression. So ended up moving from that position actually down to the state of North Carolina and taking a position with a contract research organization or CRO called ROE that actually originally spun out of Chapel Hill a number of years back now. That was an opportunity to work in really broad-based product development. It was a regulatory affairs focused position, but really involved everything from bringing companies into the clinic to getting them out again and doing all the work along the way. So designing clinical trial protocols, negotiating and navigating the FDA, submitting INDs and NDAs and various regulatory documents, and really, again, working on that full spectrum of working in that product development space from sort of late preclinical all the way through to when products get approved. It was during that time that I realized that I had a lot of business interests in this the biotech industry, and had done a little independent consulting on the side to get a flavor for what does venture capital look like, what's some of the language that's spoken in these industries and such, and decided to formalize that by going back to school while working, doing the executive MBA program at UNC, which was a fantastic experience that I'm happy to talk quite a bit about, but did that from 2017 to 2019. Did a concentration in finance to really try and counterbalance the science PhD, bringing some of those finance skills along the way. While doing that program, transitioned jobs once more, this time going to a local life sciences boutique strategy consulting firm, Triangle Insights Group. So this was, if you're tracking the story so far, started off at the bench, worked in product development along the way, and this was sort of the end of the road there in terms of working at the commercial side of industry. So doing a lot of commercial forecasting work, some corporate strategy, basically that broad-based strategy piece that pertained to the business side of the industry there. Was there for about a year, got some great experience, and then took that to NovaQuest just over 3 years ago now. So let me go ahead and pause there. That was the broad-based background. There's a number of different pieces along the way, but kind of happy to delve into different aspects of that.
Terrific. And that very much aligns with the first question that I'm going to ask is, what steps did you take to land in your current career? Again, you kind of took us through some of those steps, but can you tell us a little bit more about the skill building pieces of those steps and why it was important to you, like even that step back to the bench and back forward? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some nice concrete pieces I'll talk about within here, but maybe one of the overall pieces is just the sort of leaving yourself open to serendipity aspect. So landing the position at NovaQuest and actually landing my first job or internship actually at the very beginning of all of this. When I was an undergraduate, landing the first internship that I did at the NIH, they both came about through networking and through that sort of serendipitous networking of reaching out to people that you don't know, and likewise following through with those people after the fact. So on the NovaQuest side, I'd reached out to a gentleman who was a principal at NovaQuest at the time. This was shortly after I moved down to North Carolina. I did my PhD at the University of Michigan, saw that he was a Michigan alum, saw that there was this firm doing some kind of interesting life science investing. And so shot him a note on LinkedIn and said, hey, can we grab coffee or lunch or something sometime? And can I pick your brain about what it is that you all do at NovaQuest? He was nice enough to respond. We had a nice lunch. We had a chance to get to know each other. This was probably 5 years before the position at NovaQuest actually materialized. So it was kind of planting that seed early on, keeping up with him along the way, letting him know what I was doing in my career, asking him about what was going on in his, keeping up to date on sort of where NovaQuest was headed as a firm. And when a position opened up that ended up being the sort of position that aligned with my skill set and my interests, I fortunately was top of mind for him. And so he reached out about that. So that's the sort of soft skill side of just leaving yourself open to serendipity and opportunity. It was that long-term networking piece that got me, I'll say, early in line for a position that opened up. That, you know, these aren't the sort of things that you necessarily see advertised typically, but that come through word of mouth. A little bit more on the structured side of that, though. What I do at NovaQuest, as I alluded to at the beginning, it's really a compilation of a lot of these previous roles, because what we do is pretty broad-based as investors. We need to understand whether a product development program is going to work, and if it works, if it's going to be commercially successful. There's a lot of pieces that go into that. And so I have to be able to at least speak the language of, or be somewhat fluent in everything from manufacturing to clinical development to biostatistics to commercial forecasting. Not saying I'm an expert in any one of those areas, but I think what I've managed to cultivate along the way, some intentionally and some just, you know, you dumb luck along the path of your career, is being able to ask reasonably intelligent questions of these various disciplines. I know something that I'll bring up when I've interviewed for jobs in the past, and when I'll talk with people in forums like this, is you can find a lot of people that have a lot more direct experience in any kind of one aspect of the life science industry than I do. There's folks that have been, you know, very concentrated in regulatory affairs or very concentrated in banking. What I've cultivated along the way and what served me well to this point is that sort of broad-based experience that I have, and being able to have kind of demonstratable capabilities along the way. And whether that's the degrees that I've done, whether that's the positions that I've taken, or whether some of it ends up being the networks that you build and the credibility you establish through that. I'd say those are some of the key pieces that have gotten me to where I am now, and that serve me well on a daily basis as well in the work that I'm doing.
Terrific. That was a kind of tied everything together, I believe.
Retrospectively, that always works great. I'd love to say that's all perspective, but that wouldn't entirely be true.
Oh, absolutely. And also, thank you for mentioning kind of the serendipity, and also reaching out, and relationship building is so very important. You know, the more people you meet, the more opportunity you have. So it's really neat to see an actual, you know, example of that. So thank you so much. So a follow-up is, although I think that we're aware of a number of careers or a number of role titles, can you tell us, though, what skills, abilities, and experiences do you really regularly use on a daily basis?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the advantages of working at I say a smaller firm, just given that, you know, we don't have a ton of verticals, but a lot of people that have specialization in certain areas, but end up working across kind of broad swaths of the business, is that you get to use a lot of those various skills. So as far as what I use on a daily basis, a lot of what centrally I do ends up focusing on those very product development specific pieces. So a lot of what I do, and a lot of the way that the funnel works for investing, is you screen a ton of opportunities. I mean, we screen basically several hundred deals a year, end up doing a handful of actual transactions. So there's a lot of attrition along the way. A lot of what I do starts really on the clinical development, product development side. And if you want to get real specific within this, a lot of my real initial triage work, it calls on the work that I did at the CRO, a little bit of what stemmed from the PhD, but maybe not as directly tied to the science, but basically going through clinical data packages, regulatory affairs correspondence, and commercial forecasts to see if these companies that we're talking to, they'll put forth a vision of what it is that they're trying to develop. My job is to go in and say, do the data support what the company's trying to show and what the company's planning to do? Do they have the sorts of agreements and alignment with the regulators that they need in order to have this be a product that ultimately gets approved? And I mean, broadly speaking, is there a commercial opportunity at the back end? And if so, do we kind of believe in what the magnitude of that would look like? Or can we form an internal belief of what that would look like and structure accordingly? So really starts with the product development pieces. That very quickly, though, feeds into a lot of the financial considerations, a lot of what the executive MBA program really helped me out with, which is, how do you translate that into a transactable opportunity? Part of that is pricing the risk that we see around here. A more risky program is going to be something that is going to carry a higher cost of capital. Structurally, though, what sort of levers do you have to account for the risks that are identified on the product side? If you see that something as a risky development path, there's certain ways you can tranche capital going into an investment here. It's something that maybe we have a very different view of the commercial opportunity than the company, well, there's structural ways that we can work to bridge that. I'm not necessarily the one building those models, but I'm one that's helping translate those findings that we have on the product side into both potential opportunities for structural pieces and then kind of responding to what we generate from a modeling standpoint.
Terrific. Thanks so much. And right now, I'd like to open it up to the crowd because these are some interesting topics that I think people might want to know a little bit more about. So please, if you have any questions at this point, feel free to raise your hand, just unmute. Start the conversation. The uncomfortable silence. Well, I might start with something because again, too, or Neil, did you have a question?
Well, yeah, I mean, I did want to jump in and ask Devin, like, is there anything that, I mean, this might be a little broad, but it's getting a conversation going. Is there anything that excites you about what's going on with certain opportunities in phase 3? Anything specific that just looks exciting? Yeah, I'm just curious to start there.
Yeah, you know, this is surprisingly one of the tougher questions I get asked, and the reason for it is it's a simple sort of question, but the investing that we do is very indication agnostic, therapeutic type agnostic. It's really about what rolls up into a good development program, and that doesn't necessarily depend on, okay, you know, is this gene therapy versus is this something rheumatology based, or, you know, is this something that's using small molecules, or so it ends up being a very general question. I'll say the non-answer first is that I'm most excited about product development teams that are really building meaningfully off of their existing data, as opposed to companies that are really looking to take large extrapolations. That's just not something that fits great with our investment model. And really what our job is, I think probably the easiest term to define what we do would be growth capital. We're looking to take good ideas that have proven out that clinical proof of concept and just help them get across the finish line. So as opposed to maybe more on the venture side where it's about, well, what's the next exciting technology that's coming through? For us, it's more about what are the good technologies that have shown good proof of concept that just need the financial resources to go out and make a difference for these companies and for the patients that they serve. So that was a total non-answer to your question, because there's not something you can go out and invest in tomorrow based on that. But it's also part of the fun of what I do is that I have sort of background in a few different areas like oncology for the graduate work that I did that comes in handy when I'm reviewing oncology programs, but a lot more of what I do is getting up to speed on a ton of different indications in a relative hurry as we look at just a whole variety of options. I'll say though, one thing that's recently caught my attention that is not a NovaQuest investment target just yet, but maybe in the next, we'll call it 5 to 10 years to give it a nice wide range. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the cell therapy space. The industry itself, I think, seems to be at a nice kind of tipping point of, there's a number of products that got approved within the last year. And so you're getting that proof of concept for what it takes to get approved. I think reimbursement is still a tricky space there. And so you're having, you know, optimistically, we'll say over the next year or two, a chance to figure out how you reimburse effectively for this entirely different class of therapeutics. And then you have this next generation that's coming through. In particular, B-cell or engineered B-cell therapies are something that it's caught my attention. But like I said, these are just sort of coming into the clinic right now. So not really a NovaQuest target, but if you're looking for something to pencil in, I have high hopes for what that may end up showing along the way.
Terrific, thanks. That does sound exciting, actually. All right, Paul.
Hey, Devin, thanks for joining us tonight. I actually work at Triangle right now, and I was kind of curious if you could talk about some of the things that you do that are most different and most similar to what you did when you were at Triangle.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to meet part of the Triangle. I would call you alumni group, but you're still there. But you know, part of the Triangle group here. Yeah, Triangle was a fantastic experience for getting to learn a whole lot really quickly. I was only there for about a year, but had the chance to work on, it was probably 10 or 11 different projects, some in great depth, some of them, you know, a little bit more transiently, but I took a ton from the work that I did there and use a lot of it on a daily basis with what I'm doing at NovaQuest. So at a basic level, the ability to both generate and understand a commercial forecast is probably one of the biggest pieces. I had done no forecasting work prior to going to Triangle. So understanding both from a technical standpoint, here's how to open up an Excel document and look at an epidemiologic based forecast, work your way from top to bottom, and understand how the assumptions build on each other and how the mechanics of a model actually work. So that's a hugely valuable piece. What's probably the biggest overall value, though, that I took from it was knowing how to conduct primary and secondary market research. When we do our diligences, it's really sort of two halves, the product side and the commercial side. The commercial side is exactly what you do at Triangle Insights, which is going out and you talk to physicians, you talk to payers, maybe you talk to patients depending on the indication, and you get a sense for what's really happening on the ground. You do your secondary work where you're going out and you're reading articles and you're scouring the medical literature to figure out, okay, what are the epi numbers that are associated with this disease? What's the competitive landscape look like? And then you bring all that together into, and you talk with the payers as well, right? And figure out what's their sensitivity to pricing and what are access restrictions going to look like. And then you bring that together into a forecast that accounts for the opportunities, accounts for the discounts along the way. We use consulting firms like Triangle Insights as part of our diligence process. And I think it makes it so much easier sitting across the table when you're someone who's sat in the seat of the people that you're talking with. On the product side, we likewise use a number of different CROs that have a roundtable of their experts in these various functional areas. And so being fluent in the language that they're speaking, not just on the product areas and not just on the commercial areas, but knowing that, hey, if I ask this is going to be something that I know you're going to be up all night doing, and being able to relay and say, I know the pain that I'm causing you, and I'm going to try and minimize it as much as possible, but being able to have that level of empathy, I think helps. I've meandered a little bit away from your actual question there, but really the ability to go in and do these commercial forecasts, a huge value. If I'm going to give one last kind of broader philosophical answer, it's the consulting mentality and framework that you learn to build around complex situations comes in handy constantly. It's just sort of a way of approaching problems. I think the PhD is nice because it teaches you comfort with uncertainty and being a scientist and sort of dealing with things in that way. Consulting gives you a framework for actually navigating that uncertainty. And that mentality has served me well. Plus you learn how to make slides like quickly and beautifully. And yeah, that skill is going to come in handy no matter what you do.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And that actually feeds into a couple of my next questions. More so the question of what skills and experiences do you use most from your MBA graduate and or business education and or experience. Already, I think you brought up 3 really great ones: the market research, consulting framework, and obviously being comfortable with uncertainty. Are there any others, though, that you can think about from more specifically a business type background in education that you can use every day?
Yeah, you're gonna have to cut me off so I don't talk too long about this, but I'll start with another soft skill sort of answer. So did the executive MBA program. I'm not sure how the curriculum from that necessarily fully compares to the MBA program, but I can tell you a large chunk of the benefit that I got out of the executive MBA was probably in those first couple weeks of basically going through and doing some self-discovery around, what are your work styles? What are your predispositions in various ways? What are you excellent at? What are your weaknesses? And we did a lot of these, things that I think a lot of times it's easy to roll your eyes about, a lot of these self-evals, and we had some 360 feedbacks and everything else. But I came out of that understanding myself so much better, and really understanding what gets me excited about the work that I do, areas that I'm going to naturally be a lot more comfortable and a lot more capable in, and likewise those areas that are not core strengths for me, really understanding, bringing those to the surface, and being able to not have those be surprises or kind of as unexpected of things as I go through, whether it's a project at work or my wife will be the first one to tell you, she's like, you became a much better husband after that, first month. You sort of understood yourself a bit better. So soft skill answer there, but crucially important along the way, and something that's just served me well in the business world and in the personal world for that matter. On a little bit more hard skills kind of basis, for what I do, I did the concentration in finance in the executive MBA, and it was an interesting way of approaching it because like I said, I had done some commercial forecasting work kind of mid-program while I was at Triangle, but outside of that, had not really done any financial modeling at any point. So I learned about things like, I learned about IRR, your rate of return, about MOICs, your multiple on invested capital, and learned those from really an academic sense of, okay, I understand how these come together. I learned how to crunch some numbers and do some equations. But having that sort of foundational knowledge to then go into the role that I took at NovaQuest and have that be something that then I could sort of feel what these all meant, as opposed to just understand how it worked on a page. Having that education in place ahead of time, I'm confident I would have been able to learn, all of these different pieces on the fly if I had to, but it gave me such a head start, and I'd say such a deeper understanding of this space. It's a basic sort of thing, right? Understand finance and you're going to do finance better. But especially to come into that a little bit more mid-stage in my career, it's been hugely valuable throughout, and was a large part of what I was looking to hopefully take from that executive MBA program. I think one other piece to touch on as well is this isn't something I necessarily get to exercise a ton in the role that I have right now, but when I need to, it's helpful, is the understanding and the sort of workshopping and case studies and all that around corporate strategy. Some of which I got a little flavor for when I was at Triangle Insights with some of the projects we do with companies that would be maybe about kind of portfolio prioritization. You get into a little bit of the internal considerations at these companies. A lot though from the executive program, and again, a ton of different case studies, a number of good classes that I took, and a lot of good weekend programs, and dealing with just some of my other classmates that come from different segments of the industry, and certainly entirely other industries, of just understanding what a good management philosophy looks like, what a lot of those issues that you encounter with boards and with management teams may look like, and how to navigate some of those thornier issues. We don't take board seats typically in the investing that we do. We're a little bit more passive investors and passive managers of our investments, but inevitably there are times where you're getting involved with companies in very, very tricky situations, whether it's a difficult funding environment or financing environment that they're moving into post-R financing, or whether it's decisions at the board level that the programs we've invested in are going to be impacted by or are impacting. It's helped bring me a perspective to bring to the table, having not necessarily worked in those roles, but being able to sort of educationally understand and be able to contribute along those lines. It's definitely been a benefit.
Terrific, thank you. And in response to that, is there anything that you wish you would have gained? Because it sounds like you have got a really full toolbox of skills, but thinking back, even like your undergrad, your grad, MBA, is there something that you wish you would have done at the time that you can impart maybe to folks that are still in that realm, or maybe thinking about a graduate degree or, an executive degree?
How much time do we have for this one? Because I could go on for a while, but no, I mean, when I tell a story like this, there's a lot of nice, not entirely retrofitted, but I'm sitting at the point of being at the stage of my career that I'm at and being able to look back towards the beginning, and you see how the pieces come together there. But there are people that have a lot more foresight than I had moving through this process here, that yes, I'm happy with where I've ended up, and yes, I'm happy with the career that I've developed, but who's to say that different pieces couldn't have happened sooner or more efficiently? I think really taking the time to think about the career that you want to have. And so, think about the position that you want to have 3 or 4 or 5 positions from now. Are you working towards being a CEO? Are you working towards being a CSO? Are you working towards running a nonprofit? Are you working towards running a lab at a university? Taking that sort of long range vision and doing the back calculations to see, okay, well, here's where I am right now. What are the different paths that are going to get me there? And then within that, what might those most efficient paths be? It's a nice philosophy. I'd say that I took things a little bit more one step at a time earlier on, and then took a little bit more of that forward-looking view. And that's what helped me make decisions like doing the executive MBA program, making some of the job transitions that I did. But you can force yourself as an undergraduate or as a graduate student to take that long-range view and then calculate it back, not just where do I want to go and be an analyst or an associate coming out of this program, but again, what do I want to be doing in 10 or 15 or 20 years? I think that's hugely beneficial. I think also layering in the consideration that I'll say as a scientist, in a PhD program back in the day, maybe this doesn't get talked enough about. I think it does a little bit more in the MBA programs. What do you need to earn and where do you want to live in order to have the life that you want to have? Because there's great opportunities to do positions that make a certain pay that you're going to get so many rewards out of what you're doing. And if that's what checks the boxes for you, that's great. There's other positions that, if you need to make a ton of money in order to have the lifestyle you want, that's fine as well. But just know these are the positions you're going to need to look at. You're talking about the life sciences industry and you're talking about the biotech industry. Well, to what extent are you willing to live in Boston or San Francisco in order to be right in the mix of everything that's, going to be in the top of the headlines versus to what extent do you want to have the lifestyle balance that you can have down in North Carolina where you're still going to have resonance in the field, but there's going to be certain gravitational pulls to some of these parts of the country. It's a hand-wavy answer, but all of which is to say, thinking about the lifestyle that you want, thinking about what excites you professionally, and trying to, again, back calculate that to where you are right now in your career. I think that taking a little bit more of that forward-thinking vision would have been something that would have benefited me along the way. My wife would tell you that she sort of knew what it is that I should be doing, and it just took me a while to figure it out. So maybe also find yourself someone who both has this good visions that they can share with you and has the patience to wait for you to catch up to them.
Terrific answer. Again, very holistic, but very honest. And I appreciate that for the crowd, because sometimes when you're in it, you're not thinking about 5 years, 10 years down the road, or as you said, sometimes folks are embarrassed to think about how much money do I need? That's a really important question, or what lifestyle or where. So absolutely fabulous. So again, I'm going to pause for some good questions. Again, anything you've heard or anything you might be interested in, again, about the vertical or this industry, please feel free to raise your hands. All right, and is it Guy?
Yes, It's Guy. Thank you for taking the time. I'm a junior here at UNC in the business school, and interestingly enough, I'm part of a club, an investment club, and we're pitching today Edwards Life Sciences. And I thought you would be the perfect person to ask this question, but I read a little bit on their on the industry analysis, and we kind of studied how higher interest rates will affect funding for clinical trials negatively. And I don't know much about the field, but I would love to get a little bit more details on that. I know it's kind of outside of the career topics we were talking about, but I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, happy to talk about that. Your question, though, let me make sure I'm reading it back to you correctly, is really what are the impacts of higher interest rates that we would expect on clinical trials? Is that great? Yeah, so it's I'll try not to get too long-winded about this, but it's an interesting one from the perspective of what we do at NovaQuest, because you basically have a handful of different types of financing that are going to help run these clinical trials. You have equity-based financing that's going to come into these companies and be distributed as needed, to run trials. If a company is mature enough, you have debt-based financing. I'd say maybe earlier on you have venture debt that's going to help somewhat. It's more at the back end that you can secure lower interest rate debt that is going to help typically more catalyze these commercial launches as opposed to run the trials. And then along the way, you have opportunities for things like what NovaQuest does, which is this non-dilutive product financing. You have also maybe the one other piece of the puzzle here for clinical trial financing would be royalty financing. Royalty Pharma is one of the names that some people tend to be familiar with. That though still tends to be a bit later stage. It sort of aren't going to typically come in until you maybe have an approved product and some launch trajectory. So to get to your actual question here about higher interest rates, that's something that, at least from my perspective, it's going to impact the industry as a whole. But it's not so much something that, especially if you're talking about more biotech type companies that aren't big pharma and don't have, tons of products that are already approved and have that sort of cash flow already going. The interest rates aren't necessarily going to be something that I would expect impacts those trials as much, because they're going to be so much more dependent on equity, or if they're late stage enough, product finance type investment there. That's ignoring the sort of macroeconomic considerations of, higher interest rates are going to have certain impacts on the equity markets. You can see what's happened with the XBI and with, public biotech companies. And yes, it has that ripple effect. But as far as those higher interest rates directly impacting that, I'd say not as directly related to clinical trials themselves. The one other piece I'll throw in there, because this was interesting perspective I heard recently that I think makes some intuitive sense, is that where you might also see those higher interest rates really impacting things is more on the M&A side of the industry, where yes, you have some pharma companies that have a lot of cash on the balance sheet, but the idea of raising debt in order to go and do kind of big splashy M&A deals, not something that's going to be as appealing right now. Let me know if that kind of got around some of the question you were asking, if that raised some additional ones along the way, because obviously I'm happy to talk, shop all day.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Terrific. And Macklin has a question.
Hey, Devin, thanks for joining us. I graduated in May. I actually work for LabCorp now, and I was looking at your LinkedIn and saw that you did some work in oncology and companion diagnostics, and that was got the wheels turning. So obviously LabCorp, huge diagnostic company. Companion diagnostics is something that I've tried to do a ton of research on myself. As far as it goes in your personal work now, do you see general shifts toward precision medicine and what y'all are investing in? Or I guess what kind of, in the last 3 years that you've been at NovaQuest, or do you see a shift in therapeutic areas that you're starting to invest in? And as companion diagnostics sort of bleed out from specifically being in oncology into other therapeutic areas, are you more interested in investing in things that potentially have a companion diagnostic? Just all very high-level questions of stuff that popped into my head when I saw companion diagnostics. Thanks for anything you've got.
Yeah, no, congratulations on recent graduation and all of that. As far as companion diagnostics go, I'm pausing to think. I don't know that we necessarily have. I don't know that we have many investments that have a companion diagnostic associated with them, but maybe to the core of your question here, it makes it a lot more appealing when you have anything that gets you more precision around the product that you're developing. I think that where we tend to see this more play out in the opportunities we look at, and caveating this by saying we don't do a lot of oncology investing just because of the intrinsically higher failure rate there. I can give you a whole lecture on that, but there's not as great carry through between some of the earlier response-based endpoints in oncology and some of the later survival-based ones. So it makes it a little bit trickier for us to underwrite investments, but the good ones still find their way through. Where we tend to see it more is not so much in the companion diagnostic side, but in the design of the molecules themselves. And so, if you have a very selective kinase inhibitor, or you're dealing with a rare disease and targeting a very specific pathway there, I'd consider that kind of like a proxy for a companion diagnostic, right? You're not doing something that's just a broad-based aspirin that's going to hit all sorts of different things and you hope for the best. You're going after specific pathways that are fundamental to the disease itself. And so especially in the rare disease space, a lot of times you'll see that that's more of it's not so much a companion diagnostic as much as it is a diagnostic for the disease, which we can talk about if needed, the distinction between those two. So companion diagnostics, always a benefit, hasn't really been a determinant for us in our investing, but the principles underlying it, I think, are helping reshape the field in general and are helping are some of the higher potential opportunities that we look at as a firm.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I appreciate it. Sorry, that was super specific. It wasn't very high level, but that was probably the most niche question you'll get.
No, and maybe if I can take a quick second on that point, since it is Rare Disease Day, for anyone who doesn't know, end of February is always a day to recognize rare diseases that are out there. Work like what LabCorp does to have these diagnostics be something that isn't necessarily a companion for a product, but that are diagnostic upfront, whether it's in the prenatal or postnatal screening that takes place, or something that's part of these visits for the respective physicians along the way. That's such a huge help from a patient perspective, obviously, and from an investor perspective. The more of these kind of important diagnostic tests that are out there, the more patient populations are unlocked for us to invest in therapies for. One of the big hurdles we'll encounter in the rare disease space is just not so much a hurdle, but a consideration of, if this isn't something that's already screened for, how is this company, if this product gets approved, going to be able to increase those screening rates and find the patients that are going to benefit from this medication? And there's ways to go about that, and there's plans in place and all of that, but the more that can be done up front, the better. So just a quick plug for the rare disease space in general, and for the diagnostic work that enables a lot of these technologies and products to reach the right patients.
Terrific. Thank you. And I think you were speaking of maybe defining some words. First of all, you spoke about this at the beginning, non-dilutive. Can you explain that to the crowd?
Yeah, absolutely. So equity is dilutive, right? It's where you take an ownership stake of the company, and basically if an investor's coming in and owning part of the company, well, that was part of a company that was owned by someone else before, or is, basically diluting out the ownership of people that already own stakes in the company. We're non-dilutive because the investing that we do is purely based on the returns on the sales generated by the product or cash raised by the company. So we don't take an ownership stake in a company that we invest in. Debt is sort of the classic non-dilutive investment, and maybe is a little bit easier for folks to think about than this product finance piece, because debt comes in and it says, here's some money, you owe us money in return, and once you pay that money back and you pay it with this interest rate, then that's what you owe. Equity says we own part of your company, and if your company goes up 10,000 fold in value, well, guess what? Our ownership stake just went up 10,000 fold in value, and that was potential earnings that you've now lost out on, or potential ownership that you lost out on. There's a ton of advantages to equity. There's a ton of important times for equity. Non-dilutive, though, means you're not diluting out ownership from typically the founders at the outset or other investors as these companies mature and build out their corporate finances.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. My next question moves on a little bit to people that might be interested in getting into more of this industry, some pivoters, folks that might not even have any scientific backgrounds at all. Can you give just a little insight into what you might look for in people applying to roles, and how can people pivot into some of these roles?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've had the pleasure of making several pivots along the way myself. I think first and foremost, because being a financial shop, we'll see people kind of come from both realms. We'll see people come from the science side that are looking to come and do investing, and we'll see people that are coming from the pure finance side that are coming and looking to do biotech investing or life science investing. I mean, first and foremost, an interest and understanding of the industry, which isn't to say you need to have worked in it before, which isn't to say that you need to be a scientist or what have you, but going out and reading the news, kind of getting a feel for what does biotech look like? Who are some of the big players? Who are some of the big pharma companies? What are the exciting products that you're seeing headlines about right now? And just being able to kind of quantifiably demonstrate that interest that you have. So when you sit down in an interview setting and I have the chance to throw the question at someone and say, what are you excited about in the industry right now? What's a product that's caught your eye recently? You have some understanding already in place around just what's this world that you'd be getting into. So that's at kind of a basic level. Beyond that, it's helpful to just go and getting back to the networking piece. A lot of this is learning about how people think in the industry that you're looking to get into. And so whether you're pivoting from science or whether you're pivoting from business or whether you're doing something in English, right, and looking to come into this realm, get out and have conversations with people who work in the jobs that you want to have someday, both to build those networks and open yourself up to those opportunities that might come through them, but also to learn about how people think about and how people talk about the industry. And that'll help refine some of those skills to go and build out. Just some of it is even learning how to casually use some of the terminology that you've probably heard me throw out here, or you'll hear people throw out in other calls, and have that actually mean something and not just be a handful of letters that are being thrown your way or a term that you're like, I've heard that before, but I don't actually know what that means. Again, I've done so many coffees and beers and lunches and whatnot along the way that have really benefited shaping my understanding to then go and do my homework around different pieces that end up making specific sense. I'm trying to think if there's maybe a more, I see that there's a hand raised on here, so I'll pause in a second, but yeah, I think it's really about figuring out also that balance between what skills do you have that are going to translate well into a business like this, and going and sharpening those, because there's going to be a lot of people that can do financial models. There's going to be a lot of people that understand science, but if you have a hook within that, I think that's something that's always going to be advantageous. If it's a particular therapeutic space that you're working on as a scientist, or if it's a particular focus on a certain segment of modeling, or you go out and you take the time to learn about a recent royalty transaction and show that you can model that out too. Just demonstrating that initiative and building some core capabilities there is going to be something that just sort of disproportionately distinguishes you from other folks looking to make a similar pivot.
Terrific, thank you. And Paul.
Thanks. This is actually kind of a non sequitur. So maybe if people want to ask about pivoting more, that I can wait.
I say go for it, and then we can circle back.
Right. I actually just had two questions about how the business works. The first is, I think you mentioned you screen hundreds of deals a year. I'm just curious how many of them get to like epi-based forecasts for revenue. And then the second question is, would you be able to elaborate on what your relationship with an investment looks like after you've closed?
Yeah, absolutely. So, right. So we screen several hundred a year. The way that our diligence process works, maybe to give a little bit of framework around this. So we have our upfront internal triage. And so that would be folks like myself, or we have some associates as well that come from the consulting space, and some other scientists on the team. We'll go through and we'll take that initial look, figure out what's worth having additional conversations. If this is something that progresses beyond that point, then we still keep it in-house and we basically do our own internal modeling work, which tends to be a little bit, call it a very light and fast forecast. We'll go and we'll pull a little bit of information out of the literature to make sure, okay, if the company has a forecast, do their patient numbers and everything else seem generally in line with what we can find out there. We'll use that to build basic economic terms. We call them our indicative economic terms. We look to get agreement from the company on what those terms look like. We then look to move that to a more formalized term sheet, which is call it anywhere from like 3 to 8 page document with some of the product finance specific terms spelled out. Again, to make sure that the companies are both interested and that we're aligned with them as far as what this potential transaction is going to look like. That's when we bring in the external diligence team to go and dig deeper and I would say validate, but it's not about validating. It's about understanding and pressure testing what we put in place from the outset. So we look to stage gate this as much as possible is the real message there. So for the 300 or 400 or so deals that we do every year, call it maybe a couple dozen, make it to the full diligence stage like that, from which we'll go in, we'll have the product side, but then we'll also start the commercial forecasting work. And as you're probably familiar from working at Triangle, we even sort of stage gate that as well, where we'll go and we'll have the consulting firms do the secondary market research. So go and do a lot of literature searching and basically make sure that, again, the hard facts of the commercial opportunity are ones that we can substantiate and ideally are coming out somewhere in the same ballpark as the company before they then go out and do the primary market research, where you have to get, we typically do, call it 5, 10, 15 interviews along the way to hear what the physicians, the payers, patients, and other folks are saying. So yeah, it's a fairly high attrition rate because, again, we try to stage gate it because it's both what's an efficient use of the resources in terms of time that we have on our end. It's also not a cheap process to run a diligence process. And so, we want to make sure that we're not unlocking those funds unless it's something that we have both a commitment from the company that we're working with, but also enough belief on our end that it's hopefully more confirmatory diligence than it is, we still don't really understand the size and shape of this market. We're going to go out and just hope for the best. There was a second part to your question, and frankly, I forgot it on that long monologue there.
Sure, no, that was great. Thank you. The second question was, what does the post-close relationship look like?
Yeah, so for the type of investing that we do, one of our kind of selling points along the way is that we try to take as hands-off of a governance position as we can while still monitoring our investments. So we almost never take board seats. There's a few select transactions where it's made sense from a governance standpoint for us to have board representation, but our typical model is we basically have quarterly interactions with the company in these sort of joint steering committee or funding agreement oversight committees is what we're calling them these days. So think of it as essentially the equivalent of like a board meeting, but focused on the specific product and indication that we've invested in. Company will give us information on here's where we are in enrollment in our trials. here's any notable hirings or firings that we've had along the way. Here's what we've heard from regulators, or if there's any legal actions taking place, just as kind of core updates on the program. What we really look to do is do a ton of work in our diligence process to then underwrite a plan that, as long as the company's not significantly deviating from that, we're just being more or less fed the information we need in order to understand how that program's progressing and adjust our models accordingly as far as what that investment looks like in our models and what that looks like from a portfolio standpoint as we build out these different investments. That's how it goes under good circumstances. Inevitably, there's some programs where things might go sideways a little bit, or other things will come up, and then we'll have a little bit more regular interaction. We have some consent right over certain pieces if the company's going to really kind of deviate far from this program that we aligned on from the outset. But the goal is to keep it to more or less, call it, those quarterly type check-ins that are, again, sort of board level interactions.
Terrific. Thank you. And right now, I want to put it out for any more questions before I get to our last question. All right. And this is my favorite question because I do think it really does help and shows a little bit of the personality of our guests. What are some favorite books, online publications that you find valuable to your work or your personal growth?
Yes. All right. So it's a timely question because I'm still in sort of New Year's resolution phase of trying to, do better on the things that I didn't end the year as well on. And one of those has been making sure I get out more and get involved in kind of more of the macro side of the industry as opposed to just the transactions that we're working on. So as far as favorite online publications, so if you're looking for news in biotech, I guess first of all, a plug for it. If you don't already use a sort of feed aggregator, I'd highly recommend it, especially if you're looking at kind of industry news. But regardless, I love flowing things into one of those. The news sources I love to pull from, I'd say Endpoints News is one of the top ones for the biotech industry in general. If you want to hear what the big splashy stories are and get a reasonable perspective on those, Endpoints, Fierce Biotech, Fierce Pharma, Stat News, those are some of them at the top of my list. There's certainly plenty of other good resources out there, but if you're looking to get really a pulse for what's going on at a high level in the industry and what those big stories are, those four sources are going to get you good insight into the news as it happens. And particularly, I would say Stat News does some good deeper dive articles as well, going into some of these, whether it's the personalities or whether it's the programs in the industry. Podcasts is something that I've been doing a better job with lately. Who always has time to sit down and read, but we're all driving in a car at some point. One of the same references there, Stat News. They have a great podcast. I forget, if you look up Stat News, it'll pull it up on there. It's like First News or something like that. But they have basically 3 of their reporters sit down each week and talk about some of the top stories. They do a few interviews sprinkled in along the way. And it's a great one for, again, keeping the pulse of the news, of what's going on in the industry and what those trendy stories are. I think 2 others that I would throw in there. Again, these happen to be top of mind right now, which is convenient. If you're looking for deep dive interviews with particular, typically C-level people within the industry, Luke Timmerman is a reporter who does the Timmerman Report, and he has a podcast called the Long Run Podcast. He does kind of hour-long in-depth interviews, and he's an excellent interviewer and has just some fantastic names, whether it's the people, the company, or both that come through. And you'll learn a lot about not just the work that those companies are doing, but he really gets to the human story of the people as well. And how did they, very much a conversation like this, but you're done by the real experts, right? Of how did they come into their roles? How did they develop as scientists or as business people or as whatever path they took along the way? Real interesting stories there. The last one, I'll stop with the podcast at this point. It's called Biotech Hangout. And it was, I think, originally a Twitter hangout that was started by a few heavy hitters in the industry. I sort of ignored it for a little while, figuring it was just some, Twitter chatter kind of stuff. But they're, I don't know, 50 or 60 episodes deep at this point. I've been listening to those lately, and they have an amazing roundtable they have folks from venture capital, biotech CEOs, investment bankers, couple of investment bankers, and then we'll bring in folks as well to get really a roundtable perspective on the industry from folks that are in there and involved with it. They'll just talk sort of what are the current events, what are the latest things that are being discussed, whether it's drug pricing reimbursement, whether it's gene therapy, whether it's what's coming out of the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. But it gets an amazing balanced perspective of the sort of roundtable of folks representing the different aspects of the industry. There's been some very impressive conversations on there. And like I said, one that I had ignored for a little while, but I'm really happy that I picked up.
Terrific. How about do you have any personal reads? Are you reading anything just for fun?
So one of the things that I have neglected is like sitting down and reading books. And when I say neglected, I feel like it's been half a decade now. It was all, case studies in grad school, and then it's work otherwise. I did, though, just invest in a book, which is hopefully what will force me to actually read it. I think it's called The Silent Fire. It's a book about written by a Columbia University professor and physician talking about inflammation and kind of what connectivity it has to modern disease. And I think it's tied in with diet as well. I have literally just read the introduction at this point, so I cannot vouch one way or another for the book, except there was an NPR segment, sounded interesting, and inflammation is something I've been sort of a casual follower of, and was like, maybe I should actually read something that forces me to take an opinion one way or another. So I can't vouch for it, but I'm excited to read it. And like I said, I'm one introduction into it right now. So.
Well, we'll ask you next time you show up. Or we might have a book club. That would be pretty interesting.
Anything to force me to do these sorts of readings would be great.
Absolutely. Well, and again, thank you for just off the cuff contributing that. So again, we have just a couple of more minutes. If anyone has any further questions, feel free.
I have one as far as government regulation. How your scope intersects with keeping an eye on government regulation, and is that something that's a part of your purview that you're also paying attention to as well? You checking out the news on that, and I'll leave it there.
Good, a nice light question to bring in at the end here, but no, yeah, it's definitely. I mean, I don't know, that's part of my job description, but it's part of my purview to understand what's coming down the pike. And I mean, a recent example would be the Inflation Reduction Act, which I know has been getting a lot of airtime in the headlines and such, but more so with what we do, I'd say on the commercial side, it's something that I pay a lot of attention to, and our firm pays a lot of attention to, as far as what is the potential for that reimbursement environment to shift over time, or in what directions is it going to change. So we've been taking a lot of look at the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think as an industry, we're all sort of figuring out on the fly what the potential implications of that look like. I say the NovaQuest angle might look a little bit different than what the industry angle looks like. If you're running a company that's going to develop a product until the day it goes generic, that's one thing. Our investment horizon tends to be a little bit shorter than that. And so, that maybe ends up looking a little different, but yeah, definitely keep abreast of those developments. There's some changes also on the regulatory side, like the accelerated approval program is something that's had some changes proposed recently and a few enacted as well. So we need to stay ahead of those things. And so we do our best to stay ahead of them. Otherwise, they end up being something that comes up during diligence, and you never want to be discovering it there. So that's where a lot of these news sources are good starting points for us. And that's where also just the networking conversations, even if they're not, job focused and career development focused, but just talking with other people in the industry. I was actually just having coffee today with a friend and actually UNC EMBA alum as well, who works in business development for one of the big pharma companies, and having those sorts of conversations and just hearing not just the news that's coming out around these different regulatory actions or different government policies, but hearing about how your different industry peers are thinking about it provides some good insights as well, because it's all about how this ends up the actions that are taken from this in the end, right? As much as what the regulations themselves are, as much as what the policies themselves look like.
Terrific, thank you. And perfect timing, because we are just about at time. But Devin, I want to thank you from the CBOH, but also from our audience members, and also bringing back an alum from the MBA program is always very exciting. So thanks for taking the time and supporting not only our students, but many guests that came from beyond our current students here. So again, we hope to see everybody soon. We always have career networks activities. So please take a look and network. Talk to people, please. You've heard it from many sources here. It'll help you in your job and it'll help you in future careers as well. But we hope everybody has a great night. So good night, all.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you, Susanne.